7, 8, 9, and 10. Each one of these pages represents a budget for summer school. The largest of these is on page 7, and it's tied to the learning account. And then the last page, page 11, is a half page. You have the small increases in regular instruction, which the biggest portion of that was tied to the $500 Christmas bonuses. Also, you've had some small changes to special education, which is maintained by the state and the Fed. This is the local portion. And there at the very bottom, you have adult education, which is Stuart Sample, operates through a grant, and the money has to be moved back into his budget depending on how much of a grant he receives each year. These budgets for the Board of Education have been approved by the Board of Education. And that is the transfers. To go along with the transfers, I have a resolution that was requested by the Comptroller's office. This past year, due to the surplus in COVID and other one-time federal money, a lot of the federal money made and stay increased for a number of years to come. We've had to shield some reserve account from the general fund, general purpose school fund, the school's revenue or reserve, over to the federal reserve due to the nature of how that fund maintains. For example, the federal fund expends the money locally, and then they request a reimbursement from the feds. So this resolution is kind of what I went over when we did the transfer. We completed the transfer many months ago, and then the comptroller asked me to go ahead and ask the commission to approve this resolution to accompany that transfer. So that's what this is. And the Board of Education has already approved it also. All right, moving on. I have two budgets to go over tonight. Let's start with the Henderson County Public Schools budget. Okay, starting on page 1. As you'll notice, this is the local tax revenue. Last year, we talked about the growth in sales tax and putting a freeze. I believe last year the general purpose fund had an increase of about $400,000 in property tax, and we had talked about freezing property tax to allow the sales tax growth essentially to be moved over to the general fund. Well, this year I deducted $700,000 from property tax and increased the local option sales tax estimate to 4.6. 4.6. Based on the numbers that I ran for last year, I feel like that's on the high end. However, we can keep an eye on the 4.6, and if it continues to grow, you can even increase that estimate more in years to come. Moving over to page 2 and page 3, 2021 to 2022 to next year, they had an increase of about $1 million. And as long as they continue to maintain the level of students, we suspect even with TISA that we'll see some more growth as far as the state revenue in years to come. Going on down that page, the state revenue sharing TBA, me and Commissioner Snow, a few years ago, we had this discussion. That's just revenue that the state through TBA gives the Board of Education, but it has to be included as part of these estimates. Going on through page 5, adult education grants a little bit separate than the other revenues for the board, for the BOE. It's listed there. Also, from time to time, special education gets some small grants. The total estimated revenues for next year is $33,842,745, and that is on page 5. And going into page 6 and page 7, you will see that over the last several years, especially since COVID and a lot of the growth with sales tax, we proposed a reserve balance increase. I'll go over some of that in addition here in a few minutes. Going to page 8 starts your expenditures. Page 8 is your regular instruction program. That is the largest expenditure budget in the purpose school fund. As you'll notice, that is where your teachers, their salary and wages are. For next year, they have approved a 4% pay increase for Board of Education employees. Also, they asked for a 2% match on the health insurance, which will go from 65 to 67. Keep in mind that health insurance premiums the last several years have increased. I'd say somewhere, my guess is it'll probably increase from 4 to 5% in the next year. But your largest change on the 7-1100 is tied to the roughly 500,000 to teachers, which is the 4% pay increase. And that's page 8. Flipping to page 9. This is a smaller budget. This is your alternative instruction program. The total budget only increased by about $1,500 to $2,000, and it's tied to the 4% pay increase. So that's a small budget on page 9. Flipping to page 10. This is one of your special education programs. The special education budget, as I mentioned earlier, there's the local component, and then there's also the federal state component. This is the local. This budget is typically presented through the special education director in conjunction with the state. As you'll notice, it increased less than 100,000, and a big portion of that increase is tied to the teachers. We also figured the pay increase in this budget. Going over to page 11, this is your vocational programs. Similar to the previous budgets, really the only change here is the 4% to 2%, or the percentage of increase with health insurance. Going to page 12, there are no changes. That's a budget that's currently not being utilized. Page 13 is another one of the adult education programs. 14 is attendance. It's another small budget. Only a few $1,000 different in the total budget, and that is tied to the 4% and the health insurance. Moving on to health services support. This would be typically anything from like your nurses to the various health services provided at the school. You'll notice the total budget increased by about $22,000, and the majority of that is tied to the increase in personnel costs, the 4%. Flipping to page 16, this is your support services for students, your guidance personnel. Also, one of the smaller budgets in terms of the overall general purpose. Total increase tied to this budget, however, was the technology that I mentioned earlier. They're changing how a lot of the tech has to be reported in the general purpose school fund, and being such, a lot of the accounts at the bottom were moved over to this budget. That's why you notice the surplus and the expenditures. But with that being said, another one of your budgets has been reduced by similar amounts. So total increase tied to these tech expenditures and also the 4% in health insurance. Going over to page 17, this is your instructional staff and regular instruction program. Also, a small increase tied to the 4% and the health insurance. Going on to page 18, this is another alternative instruction program. Small increase of about $3,500 tied mainly to the 4% increase. Flipping over to another special education program budget. Total budget increased by approximately $13,000. You will notice 4% reflects a big portion of this in the salaries and also medical insurance. I did not reflect the change based off last year's expenditures. I don't expect an increase. It just depends on who signs up for health insurance. Flipping on to page 20. This is another vocation educational program. Small increase over the overall budget. As you'll notice on the top line, most of that's tied to the 4%. And then if you flip to page 21, this is what I referenced earlier about some of the educational technology being moved from one budget to the next. This particular budget had a reduction of almost $900,000 tied to that change. Flipping over to page 22 is another one of your adult education programs. Small increase tied to the salary, 4% salary adjustment. Another small budget of $162,000. Next page is where the board education board members, for the total page, you had an increase of somewhere around $500. The board committee fees did not change this year. But overall, like I said, it's only about a change of $500, and that's your board members. Moving on to 24, it's the office of superintendent. There was no pay increase for him. Also, going down, there's a small change in the medical insurance, but the overall for this budget is around $2,000, and that is office of superintendent. Next page is the office of principal. The board, in addition to the 4% on to page 28, this is the operation and maintenance of the plant. As you will notice, the total budget increased by about $70,000. A lot of this was tied to the custodial personnel. Also, you had a small increase in utilities towards the bottom. Moving on to page 29. This is another operation and maintenance of the plant budget. You had the 4% pay increase. And then you also had a small increase in gasoline. The total budget increased by about $20,000 to $645,650. Moving on to page 30, this is student transportation. This particular transportation is more tied to typically your special ed transportation. Small changes in this budget with a net negative effect. It's down about $4,000 in comparison to the previous year. Going on to other student support. This is another budget that's currently not being used, which is page 31. If you'll flip to page 32. This is a food service. It's different than the actual cafeteria. This is more for the board level supervisor tied to the cafeteria. You have the 4% increase in salary at the top, which overall the total food service budget increased by about $3,000. And like I said, the food service is also Fund 123, which is a separate budget. But moving on to estimate for property tax is $1 million, with the total, county tax revenue at $1,072,000, which is also the total estimated revenue. Going over to the next page, you'll notice, a reduction estimated in the undesignated fund balance. This fund, over the last several years, has to be maintained by the Board of Education from the standpoint that from year to year they have to put capital into this fund to make sure it stays afloat. A big part of that is the way it's funded with property tax. Being such, we do expect adequate reserves for next year. And if you'll notice on page 40, we were very conservative with the overall estimates, even though there was an increase in your bus drivers. We also had an increase with your your vehicle owners, which is your bus owners. And last, they had an increase in diesel fuel. The last several years, they have put some money towards equipment. This year, that was removed. With that being removed, you only had a small increase of about $7,000 for transportation. Moving on to page 41. Page 41 is the cafeteria fund. As you'll notice, this is what I was referring to earlier. The cafeteria fund, the director has a budget for the general purpose school fund, but the cafeteria fund, which is Fund 143, has its own set of budgets. The revenue received from individual schools is going to be significantly down again for next year. The reason behind that is the Fed and the state has been supplementing a good portion of the food costs, which means you're not receiving that locally from parents and students. So your estimated revenue for charges for current services is $150,000. With that in mind, if you flip over to page 42, you will notice the USDA school lunch program has increased by $450,000. The estimate, also the breakfast and USDA other has increased as well. Overall, you're looking at an increase of about $600,000 for federal through state. Total estimated revenues for next year are up $325,000 to $2.325 million. Moving on to page 43. You will notice the other local education reserve currently at $1 million in reserve. I will mention that I talked with the cafeteria director, and the state has asked them, moving possibly into next year, to look at spending part of those reserves. The state has a threshold of how much they'll allow them to keep in reserve. So with that being said, I know they're going to try to put more money towards food and also the possibility of some equipment in the future. So that's page 43. Page 44 is your food service expenditures. You'll notice the cafeteria personnel, you had a small increase there with a 4%. Also going down to line 422, the food supplies. Last year we reduced that amount, but based off them spending some of this additional revenue, I estimated $250,000 more in food supplies for a total budget of $2.372050. And after page 44, which is the last page of the budgets, if you'll notice, there's a one-page And, going into the county 22-23 proposed budget, the other thing that I mentioned, figured into these estimates, next year, the state has reached out to us, TCRS, and they've notified, the county that due to the recent actuary study, that our rate's gonna go up by about 75% for next year. So with that in mind, I've had to adjust some of the TCRS contribution amounts. Starting on page, well, I don't think it's got a number, but after the table of contents, you'll notice the breakdown of tax revenue. One thing I mentioned on this page, the value of a penny is slightly down from last year to this year. A big part of that is the change in the state's ratio for personal property. Being that personal property reduced, the overall property tax estimates are down about $275,000 for the county. All right, and also if you flip to the next page, the fire tax, which is also based off some of these same estimates, you'll notice that the fire tax estimate is down about $30,000 from last year to this year. All right, going on to page 1. Page 1 through 4 are the general fund revenues. Starting at the top is the property tax revenue. With the adjustments that we made to property tax, if you go back to 2021 versus the next year's estimate, it's up roughly $950,000, almost $1 million. Also, if we didn't have the small loss in personal property, it would have been over $1 million. But with that in mind, going on down, you'll notice my estimates for the lit tax for 40250 and 40266. I had to slightly reduce just based off collections this year. Hopefully, a big part of that will be tied to COVID, and we'll see some of that revenue coming back in the next few years. Going on down towards the bottom, you have your fine forfeitures and penalties. Small revenue of $57,000. That's page 1. Page 2. Also going to 42, which is 42871, which is under Chancery heading. That's another one of the fees that comes in through the court system. I slightly reduced that amount just based off what we're currently receiving for this year. Heading on down through the bottom, there's a small adjustment to the fees tied to like your telephone commission, even though it's the same. This also houses the data processing fee, and some of those fees are slightly down based off current revenue estimates. Going on to page 3, the other local revenues. Sale of material work release fees, I did increase those. The programs are starting to bring more fees in. Also, scrolling down that page, you also have your fees in lieu of salaries. These are where your fee offices, the revenue from those offices, now that they're under the county budget, they come in these revenue accounts. That's from the county clerk 4510 down to 45610, the trustee account. And down at the very bottom, you have the litter grant, the public works grant. is your other state, revenue. The largest line item on this is your contracted prisoner board. You'll notice back in 2021, we changed the amount to $1 million. In the past, we had received like upwards of 1.5, but based off current estimates, I increased it from 800 to 850 for next year. So your total other state revenue is 1.236. And then going down to the bottom, you have your civil defense. And also at the very bottom, you have the reimbursement that comes in from 911, and also the transfers from the Board of Education where they reimburse for like the school resource officers. And that's page 4. And when you skip over to page 5, you start into the expenditures for the general fund. And going back to the conversation that I had, or the comments that I made earlier, you're going to see 5% in the elected officials, a 5% in any salary and wages, and also a small adjustment to health insurance and retirement. So, starting at the top, with a small change in insurance for next year, your general administration is going to be $126,750. That is where the commission's budget is housed. No real change there. Your board and committees, that's the Board of Equalization. 2,500 from last year, I kept that amount the same. Going down to the county executive, I figured in the 5% for the salaries at the top, which account for the majority of this increase. If you go down to the bottom, the budget increased from 185,784 to 202,836. Going on to page 6, is your county attorney. Her legal fees remain the same. Really the only change in this budget is tied to health insurance. It went from total budget went from 22,895 to 24,195. And then when you flip over to the next page, this is the election commission. As you will note, the last couple of years we've seen a little increase in elections being in the midst of these elections. With that being said, I suspect this amount will drop in the next fiscal year after this next year. But starting at the top, you have the 5% pay increase. Also, that was the elected official and clerical. Then you had the bump in retirement and medical with a net increase of about 15,000 to 222,15. And that's the election commission. Moving over to the rest of these. The biggest change in this budget is you will notice I did the 5%, and then also Doug had asked for some additional help that was discussed according to Doug several years ago with the commission. I went ahead and included it in this year's budget. The total change due to that pay increase was that particular line increased by about 30,000. The total budget is up around 47,000 to 217,470. But the biggest part of that change, like I said, is tied to the additional employee. Moving on to 51,800 county office buildings. One of the larger budgets in the general purpose fund. With that in mind, the total budget increased only by about $10,000. You had the 5% for the payroll. Also, you had a increase with the overall increase in this budget of about $30,000. But a lot of this is once again tied to the 5%, also the change in medical and retirement. Going on to page 14 is your circuit court. The total for the circuit court increased 542. The only changes in there were also what I mentioned earlier. Those account for those increases with the 5% retirement and health insurance, which is also the case on page 15. I'm sorry, 649. I'm going to try to get through this. On page 15, the general sessions court, we moved from 283, 327 to 299, 191, also tied to the 5%. And the small budget at the bottom is drug court. That's a very small budget. If you turn over to Chancery Court, the only change I would note in Chancery is Lee had asked for that additional $10,000 at the last meeting that the commission temporarily approved. I went ahead and included that amount in this budget. Aside from that, you have the 5%, the medical insurance, and the increase in state retirement. Moving on to the juvenile court, this is a small budget. Most of the increase in it is tied to the 5% in personnel costs. Going on to page 18, this is one of the larger budgets in the general fund. This is the sheriff's department. The biggest part of this increase is tied to the 5%. Also, I went ahead and increased on line 399, the contracted services. We had discussed last year about the grant for the 2 positions that at the end of this year, or in October, those grants will no longer be paying for those. One is contract services and one is housed in the sheriff's department. And I went ahead and included those amounts in this budget to pick up those positions. The overall increase on the sheriff's department budget is about $200,000 up to $2,439,640. government agencies. That amount has stayed the same the last several years at $11,420. Then at the very bottom, what we discussed earlier, as far as the revenue, you have the small litter grant that the county receives each year. Very small reduction in that overall amount. Then going on to the adult activities on page 25, you will notice an increase with Southwest HRA. We participated and based off population, I believe, is how they calculate that amount. But it's increased a little bit over the last few years, and it's up to 4250. For example, Southwest HRA manages the home builder grant and other activities here within the county. Going down to senior citizen assistance, you have the 8,000 for Lexington, 3,000 for Scottsdale, 4,000 for Sardis, for a total budget of 15,000. And then below that, you have the contributions for the library. And moving on down to the bottom, I went ahead and included the amounts of who had requested. If anybody wants me to change any of these amounts, I can. I just included what was asked for. You have the vast plug, from 500 down to the bottom. The biggest changes are your 2,000 for veterans honor guard, RAP for 9606, and Francis Hopper and Kinsley for 12,000. But overall, your contributions compared to previous years are that 27,606 is less than what we paid in many years in the past that I recall. So moving on to ETA extension. I know in the last several years we talked about getting this budget up. They've increased, the Board of Education has approved some funding for UTA for an assistant. With that in mind, I went ahead and used roughly the 5% to increase the total budget by about $6,000 from 75,235 to 81,725. And then there at the bottom is the small budget for soil conservation. Also used the same logic with the 5%, the small increase to retirement for about a $10,000 increase in soil conservation. Moving on to the next page, you have your flood control, which also has your beaver maintenance. You have your tourism budget, which a lot of that's the chamber and the website, and then you have industrial highway department is similar to some of your other departments in that it has, maintenance of effort. Your trustee collections, as you'll notice, the tax estimates are pretty consistent to what we had this past year. With that in mind, the gasoline tax, I did an estimate of an increase on it based off what we're currently seeing this year. So the overall total revenue increased from 3.16 to 3.224. And then you have several budgets within the highway department. The first one, administration, where Steve's paid from 5% payroll increase. You also have an increase in medical insurance, and also the small increase in retirement. That total budget increased by about $14,000. Flipping on to the next page, you'll notice an increase of about $150,000. A big part of that's in materials. $50,000 in liquid asphalt, and another 10% increase in crushed stone from $200,000 to $220,000. Also, you have the 5% payroll increase, which takes that total budget from 1.775 to 1.925. And then moving on down to the bottom is a smaller budget within the highway in comparison to the bridge maintenance. It increased by about $10,000. That also is tied to the 5% in the mechanic, and also there's a small increase in the tires and tubes. So based off what he spent this year, I went ahead and increased it by about 10%. And then on the very back, you have other charges for the highway department. You have the insurance amounts at the top, which are pretty consistent with this year, no significant increase. Also, the employment benefits based off what he spent this year out of this account, I reduced it slightly
this is a budget committee, right?
Budget committee / work session.
Okay, if it's a work session, we're not supposed to be voting on anything.
This is the budget committee part.
I understand that, but it was never said in the ad.
In the ad, it said budget committee / work session, right?
It said budget committee commission work session.
Right. So he needs, got to vote on the floor,
Well, we have a budget committee meeting on the transfers, then we have a work session on the total budget,
Right.
to go over it. Okay? I have a motion on the floor in a second. Mr. Chairman, you do a roll call, yes or no?
For the budget.
Budget committee, I can. Myself, yes. Any answer?
Yes.
Bill Ross? Yes. Mike Lester?
Yes.
Donna Duke?
No.
And that's Todd Beecham?
Yes.
Donnie Bailey? Yes. All right, we have 6 yes. We will send it over to the full commission. I'm sorry, I missed that. Now, I'll take a motion to close the budget committee and go to the full commission.
Sorry.
Tom made a motion. Joe second. All in favor, aye. Any opposed, like sign. Now then, you know where to make.
Guys, it's already for the record 7, so if you've got some questions, we'll try to get through them before we go into our special call meeting. Again, this budget, I'll be voting on tonight, I'm voting on here for this transfer. Yes. Let's go, guys.
This work session,
This is the work session.
I can't hear anything you said.
Speak up, Tim.
I asked Lee that we needed to, take an additional 300 more thousand off the property tax up on the school side. I went and I got the figures. And as of Friday, it's already 4.485, so it's still like 2 more months of sales tax cutting. So that would be the difference. And it's still going to be a cushion. Could be 300,000.
But based off the estimates that came in last year, some of the months have started to level out, and what I was saying earlier in the, when I went over this, my recommendation is you're increasing the sales tax estimate, you're reducing that for property tax. So with that in mind,
should be 5.
And this is our opportunity now to try to make that. That's all I'm saying. I mean, I'm just trying to work with.
I do understand about making those adjustments. And I think that was part of why, this year I increased that estimate and reduced the property tax. So, I mean, we consider the general fund's property tax estimates, even with a reduction in property tax of $950,000, that's still a significant amount of revenue. And these revenues continue to stay up, next year you can make another adjustment. I guess my thing is like, with this particular revenue account, we treat it a little different than some of the other revenue accounts. Because, for example, state inmates. One year you might have $1 million, another year you might have $1.5 million. So that's a 50% difference.
I don't think I'm asking for all that much. I mean, that's, I think I'm on board with it.
It's not working with me. This is with the Board of Education.
All right, guys, any other questions?
But this is the revenue end of it, though. We are the ones that change the revenue. We don't change how they spend it.
Anything else?
I do have something I need to let the commission know in regards to the transfers on the county buildings. The day that Mayor-elect Robin McCready had his department head meeting, I was approached by Lee Milam. She was acting on behalf of the chancellor. And long story short, he wants to consider moving his court to the Justice Center. Today was the first time I've had an opportunity to actually speak with him, and I spoke with him. And he has a court date scheduled for the 23rd of this month, but he is seriously looking at considering any court dates beyond that. They won't be held here anymore. They'll be held at the Justice Center. And the only problem is in those transfers, if the court security and jail litigation money is being used to pay for the elevator, this building won't qualify anymore. So, just want to bring that to everybody's attention before the transfer is complete, just in case he decides. And I'm supposed to meet with him on the 23rd, to know for sure.
Anything else, guys?
Who you gonna meet with?
Chancellor Maroney.
All right, guys.
They don't want to court.
He's looking at not holding trials here any longer. And his main concern was court security. He just, what he asked for originally was for the same state team that would come down and do a court security assessment to come and do another one here. We've had one done, it was several years ago, probably 7, 8 years ago. Well, everyone on that team is retired, so they don't do them anymore.
And he can do that? He has the authority to do that?
Yes, he does.
You know, when we went to the justice center, we said what court would be out there.
Right.
And predicament, I think, so.
The other judge wanted to stay here, I think. The new one now wants to move.
Yeah, he actually does have that authority to use a different courtroom if he
And Brian, I'll mention it, if you notice the transfer from the lib line, it's got a backslash for the 39,000. Anything that wouldn't qualify out of the reserve account, meaning if the auditor's deemed you moved court, now this reserve account doesn't qualify, it's got that covered. That's why I referenced the 39,000.
All right, anything else? Shall we move on? All right. Take a motion to adjourn this meeting, move to special call. Sir?
You never had a motion open.
I'm asking for a motion to adjourn.
You never had a motion to open it, so why do you have a motion to adjourn it?
That's all right. Motion to adjourn. All right, Joe Ross, second. All in favor, say aye. All right, any opposed? Okay, thank you, ladies. Moving on to the special call. Thank you, guys. Take about 5 minutes break.
battery ain't went down yet.
Woohoo, we're still working, that's good.
Yes. Joe Ross. Here. percent, the word percent. It's supposed to say million instead of percent.
Any other corrections?
Make a motion to approve the bid with the correction.
Mr. Joe Ross makes a motion to approve with corrections. Todd Beecham seconds. All in favor say aye. Any opposed? Staying on the agenda, the notaries. I'll call the notaries out for you. There's only three. Mr. Brandon Dixon, Mr. Wes Hayes, Taylor Robinson. Entertain a motion to approve the notaries. Terry Allen makes the motion. Blake Chapman seconds. All in favor say aye. Any opposed? All right, next thing on the agenda is the transfers. And, turn to our finance director.
Alright, transfers went over in the, prior meeting, the first several pages are tied to the government. You have anything from the payroll increases of $1,500 this past year, the elevator, the grants, such as the home grant, the patrol vehicles, and the sheriff's department. And then also included with this, you have the payment for like the fire truck from Fund 128. And going through to page 5, you start the Board of Education transfers. These have been approved by the Board of Education. They also include the summer school. We need to get these budgets amended and money put back for like the elevator and all these pay increases. So we'll have the available budget funds for like payroll in June. But these were approved by the budget committee, and I discussed these during that meeting.
All right. Entertain a motion to approve the transfers. Todd Beecham makes a motion.
Aaron made a motion.
Say again.
Aaron made a motion.
Mr. Aaron Wood makes a motion. Mr. Todd Beecham seconds. Call the roll, Ms. Carroll.
Aaron Wood,
Yeah.
Todd Beecham,
Yes.
Tom Hay,
Yes.
Darryl Tyler,
No.
Steve Barrett. Yes. Darryl Ross,
Yes.
Johnny Hughes, no. Blake Stanley,
Yes.
One Powers, Terry Evans,
Yes.
Andy Anderson,
Yes.
Jeff James,
Yes.
Mike Ritter.
Yes.
All right, motion carries. Thank you, guys. The next thing on your agenda is the request for TCRS for the final payment on the officials' back pay. I'll turn it over.
Okay, so last year, the commission voted to give the back pay to several former elected officials in conjunction with the highway superintendent. We'd also paid a similar amount for the sheriff a few years ago. And basically what it is, there was an audit issue where the auditors had disagreed with the amount owed to these officials. We corrected it, and the commission approved to make those payments over 2 separate payments. With that in mind, TCRS has come back and asked, in order to have a better, I guess you would say, assessment of like the actuary study, and to try to confine what amounts go to which year as far as prior years, they've asked that we complete the second payment during this same fiscal year. So instead of waiting until July, I'm just asking if we can go ahead and get this payment done in June.
Question? Entertain a motion to approve.
I'm sure this is the final one.
Yeah.
I'm making a motion.
Mr. Joe Ross makes a motion. Mr. Aaron Wood seconds. Call the roll.
Aaron Wood,
Yes.
Todd Beecham,
Yes.
Tom Hay,
Yes.
Darryl Tyler,
Yes.
Steve Barrett. Yes. Darryl Ross,
Yes.
Johnny Hughes. Yes. Blake Stanley,
Yes.
Terry Evans,
your agenda is the lease proposal for the warehouse space at Henderson County Multiplex. I know you guys have a copy of the lease. I talked to Kirkland's Home Furnishing. They're looking for a place to store some stuff. They also I had left you a note in your packet because I talked to AutoZone as well. You know, AutoZone has rented from us for the last 3 years, and I don't have a lease in hand. I have talked to the plant manager. They are interested in trying to do another lease, at least for another 6 months or a year. Their rate was $5,000. Kirkland's has asked to rent it for $4,000. And I've actually talked to another company in Jackson, ALS Recycling, and they're looking for some space too. So there's 3 folks there that's possibly looking at wanting to lease this warehouse. The only thing I would ask is, we talked about the health department and the property out there. So I don't know if you guys want me to just do 2 acres, to try to get the appraisal for 2 acres, or would you want me to get the appraisal for the whole piece of property out there for the health department? I just need to know what
I
direction you guys.
I personally think this is 2 acres separated from the building, so they can go ahead if we get a good appraisal on the building health part. If we want to build that. And in that type of lease, now these people know there is a leak in that roof. We don't need,
Now,
we need to make sure we know it's out there, we want the leak.
it's a pretty big.
Yes, it is, I've been out there.
That's right, it says
That's
we're responsible
what I'm
for
looking
their
at,
stuff.
I know that one.
Right, that was Kirkland's.
Yeah,
I think it's something we need to look at before we lease.
Yeah, it would be a
If
federal
we
law.
paid $120,000 for a $60,000 lease, and then tear it down.
Yeah, we would spend.
I mean, that's
more
just
money.
reality, I know we could use money, but that roof, that money cost that whole roof right there.
So you guys, somebody tell us.
Yeah, Eddie, I was on the step down, they know the conditions.
But they're not in now, they're leased in, so they don't have anything in there. But they do know the condition of the roof, because it didn't just start with this now. So whatever you guys tell me to do, I'll move
But
forward.
that's not listed in this lease.
I don't know.
That lease that we had in
They
the
came out
package.
and say, y'all need to fix the roof, you know? because
Yeah,
it's not
I know.
leak. Just, can you look forward, table it and go back and let you talk to them? Because I hate for them to come in there and say, man, this is leaking.
So
So y'all say it's good.
You want me to get an estimate on the cost of this roof? No.
We want to take
You want to see if, they'll agree to accept the money,
Yeah, we
yeah.
will.
I think we're going to take it as a week.
All right.
So you can talk more with them. I don't want us going to lease, and then them come back and say, well, y'all signed it, y'all responsible for this. And y'all know that works.
Right. I got a motion on the floor to table. Go ahead, please. Yes. That would be my personal recommendation, but you got a motion on the floor.
But you don't have a lease agreement,
I don't know.
do you have a lease agreement with the firm?
I just don't want us to get caught. I mean, if they want to sign the stipulation that they understand the condition of the roof and they'll abide by it, and, it just needed some work done on the lease.
Right.
Okay?
So, what's your motion, please?
I mean, I would say table, you can get more information from AutoZone as far as what they want to do.
Okay, got a motion to table, I'll call it all now. Terry Allen, second. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, guys, that's all we have. It is a special call meeting, so I'll make it. Yes.
Oh,
That's,
Sir?
federal funds.
We got the resolution. All right, we got the resolution, so we need to be voted on separately.
Yes.
Got in the transfers there, we had the resolution for the Board of Education. Anything you can say, that y'all have already talked about? Anything else you need to say about it?
This resolution was recommended by the comptroller's office. Being that this deals with the federal funding for the schools, they asked for this additional clarification to go along with the transfer that was completed, last calendar year. So basically, this just, specifies the 600,000, where it's going, where it moved from, and how the funds are being used. So that's what it's for. The Board of Education has already voted to approve.
Okay.
This is not a new transfer, it's the same one we've already approved.
Motion to approve. The city makes a motion, and a second. Bishop second, call roll, Ms. Carroll.
Aaron Wood,
yes.
Todd Hilton,
Yes.
Tommy
Good night.
Yeah.